It was close to 10 at night when I walked out of the small grocery store, a couple of bags swinging at my side. The street was quiet, the air carrying the coolness that comes after a long summer day. I adjusted the bags in my hand and started toward my building. That's when I noticed them. Two tiny shapes darting near the shadows of the entryway. At first glance, they looked like kittens. Small bodies, moving hesitantly, keeping a cautious distance but clearly following my steps. I slowed down, and so did they. I turned around, and they froze, eyes glowing faintly under the street lamp. They looked thin, uncertain, and yet they didn't run when I made eye contact. Instead, they stayed close, their little paws silent on the pavement. I kept walking, testing them. With every few steps, I heard the faint sound of them behind me. They weren't giving up. Something inside me tightened, a mix of pity and curiosity. I sighed, put my grocery bags down, and crouched. They stayed a few feet away, staring at me. Their ears twitched, their tails stiff, and their gaze never left my hands. It didn't feel right to just leave them there. I picked up my bags and, after a moment's thought, turned back toward the store. Inside, I grabbed a couple packets of wet cat food and a disposable bowl. The cashier gave me a strange look when she saw my late-night purchase, but I didn't explain. I hurried back outside, and sure enough, the two little figures were still waiting. I tore open a packet, squeezed the contents into the bowl, and set it gently on the ground. At first they hesitated, standing frozen, ears flicking at every sound around us. Then, as if a switch flipped, they rushed forward and buried their faces in the food. The sound of their urgent licking was louder than I expected, desperate, like they hadn't eaten in days. I crouched nearby, watching closely. Their fur seemed rougher than I thought, not the sleek coats of house kittens. Their bodies shook slightly as they devoured every last bit of food. When they finished, they lifted their heads in unison and looked directly at me. There was no meowing, no sound of any kind. Just two pairs of wide, golden eyes fixed on me. The silence made me uneasy, but I pushed it aside. Maybe they were just too weak. I cleaned up the empty packet, tossed it into a trash bin nearby, and picked up my groceries again. When I started walking, they followed without hesitation. By the time I reached my building, it was obvious they weren't going to leave. I stood at the entrance for a long moment, debating with myself. It was late, the night air was getting colder, and they were so small. The idea of leaving them outside didn't sit right with me. Finally, with a resigned breath, I opened the door and stepped inside. They slipped in quickly, paws tapping against the linoleum of the hallway. I carried them into my apartment and placed the groceries on the kitchen counter. The two of them wandered carefully, sniffing around, their movements deliberate and precise. I took out an old blanket, folded it on the floor, and placed the empty bowl nearby, promising myself I'd buy more food tomorrow. They circled the blanket, then curled up together, pressed against each other for warmth. I leaned against the doorframe and studied them. Even in the dim light, I noticed the unusual pattern of their coats, dark spots scattered across beige fur. Their ears were pointed, tipped with tiny black tufts that quivered when they shifted. I frowned slightly. I had never seen kittens quite like this before, but it was late, and I told myself it didn't matter. They were just strays that needed a place to rest. Still, as I turned off the lights and prepared for bed, that image of spotted fur and tufted ears stayed with me, lodged in the back of my mind. The next morning, I woke to the sound of faint movement in the hallway. When I stepped out of my bedroom, I found the two little ones awake, stretching on the blanket I had left for them. Their eyes flicked toward me instantly, sharp and alert, as if they had been waiting for any sign of motion. It struck me as unusual. Kittens I'd seen before usually meowed or rubbed against legs in search of attention. These two just sat, watching, completely silent. I decided to set up a proper space for them. Carrying the blanket and the bowl, I led them toward the balcony. My apartment has a small enclosed glass balcony, bright with daylight and safe from the outside air. It seemed like the best place. I spread the blanket neatly in one corner and placed a second bowl beside the first, this time filled with water. The cubs followed closely, stepping carefully on the tiles. They sniffed around the balcony, their paws soft against the floor, then settled on the blanket. As they explored, I noticed something that kept me uneasy. They didn't meow at all, not a single sound. Instead, when one of them bumped into the other over the bowl, a low, rasping noise came out, more of a throaty hiss than anything else. It was subtle but carried a strange edge. I frowned, telling myself maybe they were simply different, or maybe too weak to vocalize like normal kittens. The rest of the morning passed quietly. I made myself breakfast while they dozed in the sunlight, curled together in a tight ball. Whenever I passed by, both lifted their heads at once, ears pricking forward, eyes steady on me. Their movements were sharp, coordinated, unlike the clumsy playfulness I expected. I tried to shrug it off. Maybe they had simply learned to survive outside. In the afternoon, as I was watering plants on the balcony, a shadow passed across the glass door. My neighbor from the floor above, Mr. Allen, leaned over the railing outside. He was curious by nature, always making small talk. He caught sight of the cubs through the glass and chuckled. "Hey, what V you got there? New pets?" I smiled awkwardly. "Found them near the store last night. Thought they were strays." He squinted, tilting his head. "Those don't look like any kittens I've seen. Look at their ears. And those coats." He raised an eyebrow, then shrugged. "Well, just be careful. They look a little wild." His words lingered in my mind long after he walked away. I turned back to the cubs. They were lying still, golden eyes fixed on me from the blanket. I studied their spotted fur, the tufts of hair rising from their ears, the short tails that didn't match the sleek lines of house cats. A knot of doubt tightened in my chest, but I told myself it was nothing. Maybe they were just an unusual breed. Nothing more. That evening, I tried giving them more food. They ate silently, quickly, side by side. Afterward, they retreated to the blanket, pressing against each other as if the world outside their corner didn't exist. I watched them until the light faded, still uneasy but unwilling to face the thought that I might have taken in something more than strays. When night finally came, I stretched out on the couch, the faint glow of the street lamps slipping through the blinds. The apartment was quiet, almost too quiet. I must have drifted into sleep, because the next thing I remember was waking suddenly, heart pounding. A sound had pulled me from my dreams. It wasn't a meow. It wasn't even close. From the balcony came a low, guttural growl, muffled but unmistakable. The hair on my arm stood up as I sat frozen in the dark, listening. Another growl followed, softer this time, then silence. I stayed there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, the weight of uncertainty pressing harder than ever. Whatever those little ones were, they weren't ordinary kittens, and I wasn't sure what I had let into my home. The following day, I couldn't shake the unease that had settled in me after hearing those growls at night. I brewed some coffee, sat down with my phone, and decided I needed answers. It wasn't enough to keep guessing. If I was wrong, I'd laugh at myself. But if I was right, then I had a much bigger problem than I thought. I opened the browser and typed, "kittens with ear tufts." The images loaded quickly, but what I saw made my chest tighten. Most of the results weren't house cats at all, they were wild cats. Page after page showed photos of lynx cubs. The resemblance was undeniable. The spotted fur, the short tails, the black tufts rising like little brushes from the tips of their ears. Even their eyes looked the same, wide and golden. I rubbed my forehead, scrolling faster, comparing every picture to the two little ones sleeping in the sunlight on my balcony. I typed another search, lynx sounds. A short video clip played, the audio spilling through my speakers. The sound was low, guttural, almost identical to what had pulled me awake last night. My stomach sank. These weren't kittens. My suspicions weren't just imagination. The evidence was stacking up in front of me. I set the phone down and leaned back in the chair, staring at the balcony through the glass door. They were curled up on the green blanket, small and peaceful, but now every detail stood out more sharply. The patterns on their fur, the silent way they moved, the way their ears twitched at every sound. I had to admit it, I wasn't sheltering stray kittens. I had brought wild lynx cubs into my home. By noon, I knew I needed to buy more food anyway. I grabbed my jacket and headed out, the weight of this new reality pressing down on me. The pet store was quiet when I entered, a bell chiming over the door. The shelves were stacked with bags of kibble, toys, and cages. I picked up several cans of wet cat food and carried them to the counter. The woman at the register, someone I'd seen many times before, greeted me with a smile. "Stocking up?" she asked. "How many cats do you have now?" I hesitated, then decided to be honest. "Actually, I found two little ones near the store. I thought they were kittens, but I'm not so sure anymore." She tilted her head. "What do you mean?" "They've got spotted coats, really short tails, and tufts on their ears," I explained. "They don't make normal kitten sounds." More like growls. Her eyes widened. Sir, those aren't kittens. Those are lynx cubs. The words hit me like a punch. You're certain? I've worked with animals for years. Trust me, I know what I'm saying. You can't keep those at home. They might look small now, but they'll grow quickly, and they're wild. It's dangerous, for you and for them. I nodded stiffly, thanked her, and left the store with the bags in my hands. The walk back to my apartment felt heavy, each step weighed down by what I'd just heard. The city looked the same, but everything had changed for me. I couldn't escape the truth anymore. When I returned, the cubs lifted their heads as soon as I opened the door. Their eyes tracked me steadily, unblinking, almost calculating. I placed the food down and just stood there, staring at them. They weren't pets, not really. They were wild animals, fragile now, but destined to grow into something far more powerful. And I had brought them into my home. As they ate, I leaned against the wall, arms folded, heart thudding. A new worry crept into my mind. How safe was this, for them and for me? They deserved a life in the wild, not trapped in an apartment. And what would happen when their instincts grew stronger than their dependence on me? I didn't have the answers yet, but I knew one thing. I couldn't keep pretending. Something had to change, and soon. By the next morning, my decision was made. I couldn't ignore what I had learned. I scrolled through my contacts until I found Dr. Harris's number. He was an old friend and a veterinarian I trusted. He had taken care of my dog years ago, and if anyone could tell me what to do, it was him. He picked up after a few rings. Hello? Haven't heard from you in a while. Yeah, I said, my voice tight. I need your help. I think I brought home lynx cubs. 2 of them. Can you take a look? There was silence on the line, then a slow, careful reply. Lynx cubs? Are you serious? I'm afraid so. Can I bring them in? Bring them here, he said finally. And be careful. They might be small, but they're not house pets. Getting them into the carrier was harder than I expected. I pulled my old beige plastic pet carrier from the closet and lined it with a towel. I set it down on the balcony and opened the door, placing some food inside as bait. One cub crept forward cautiously, stepping inside, but the moment I nudged the door, it twisted around and hissed, claws scratching against the plastic. The second cub growled low, circling outside. It took patience, steady movements, and more food before I finally managed to coax them both in. The latch clicked shut, and immediately they pressed against each other, golden eyes fixed on me through the metal grate. I carried the carrier carefully down to my car, the weight shifting as they moved. Their claws scraped against the plastic, and I could hear low, uneasy sounds from inside. The drive to Harris's clinic felt longer than it really was. Every red light made me nervous, every bump in the road a reminder that I had wild animals in the seat behind me. At the clinic, Harris was waiting at the back door. He led me straight into an exam room. The cubs crouched inside the carrier, ears flat, bodies tense. Harris moved slowly, speaking in a calm tone as he opened the door. One by one, he lifted them out with steady hands and placed them on the table. They resisted, small growls rumbling in their throats, but he kept his movements gentle. After a few minutes of examination, checking their coats, teeth, and eyes, he looked at me with a firm nod. They're lynx cubs, about 3 months old, underweight, but otherwise healthy. I exhaled, the confirmation both a relief and a burden. So what do? I can't keep them in my apartment. You can't, Harris agreed. It's dangerous for you and unfair to them. They need proper care. I'll put you in touch with the Wildlife Service. They work with a rehabilitation center. That's their best chance. I glanced at the cubs on the table. One pressed against the other, eyes darting around the room. Despite the unease, one nudged my hand briefly, as if remembering the food I had given them. My chest tightened. I had only known them a short time, but letting go felt heavier than I imagined. Harris stepped out to make a call. I stayed in the exam room, watching the cubs shift restlessly, their tiny bodies tense but full of life. When he came back, his expression was serious. I reached the Wildlife Service. They'll be contacting you directly. And there's something else. They've had reports of a dead lynx not far from where you found these 2. The words hit hard. You think that was their mother? It's very possible, Harris said quietly. That would explain why they were alone and why they followed you. If she's gone, these 2 are orphans. I looked down at the cubs, suddenly seeing them in a different light. Not just strays in need of food, but wild creatures left without a mother. Their survival now rested on me making the right choice. The weight of that responsibility pressed heavier than ever. 2 days later, the Wildlife Service called me back. They had arranged for me to bring the cubs to a rehabilitation center outside the city. My stomach tightened as I wrote down the address. I knew it was the right thing, but the idea of saying goodbye left a knot in my chest. That morning, I packed the carrier again. The cubs resisted at first, pressing against the corners, but eventually I managed to coax them inside. Their eyes stayed on me as I latched the door. Carrying them down the stairs felt heavier than before, not just from their weight, but from the finality of it. This was no longer a temporary arrangement. It was the end of our short time together. The drive out of the city stretched on. I kept glancing back at the carrier on the seat beside me. The cubs huddled close, ears flicking, golden eyes catching the light. They were quiet, only shifting occasionally, and that silence made the ride more intense. Every mile brought us closer to the moment I'd been dreading. The center sat beyond a tall wire fence, surrounded by fields and woods. Signs marked it clearly: Wildlife Rehabilitation Facility. As I pulled into the gravel driveway, 2 staff members came out to meet me. They wore green jackets with the center's logo, their expressions calm but purposeful. One of them, a woman named Claire, introduced herself. "You must be the one who found the cubs," she said, her voice steady. "Let's get them inside." We carried the carrier into a bright, clean building. I opened the latch, and the cubs hesitated before stepping out onto a padded table. Claire and another worker examined them carefully, checking their eyes, their coats, their teeth. "They're healthy enough," Claire said, glancing at me. "A little underfed, but nothing we can't fix. You did a good thing." Her words eased some of the tension, but the ache in my chest remained. "So what happens now?" I asked. "They'll stay with us until they're old enough and strong enough to survive on their own," she explained. "We'll feed them properly, limit human contact, and help them rediscover their instincts. The goal is to return them to the wild." As she spoke, one of the cubs moved closer to me, brushing against my hand before being guided back by a staff member. That brief touch almost undid me. I had only known them for a short time, but in those days, I had fed them, sheltered them, and watched them sleep. Letting go now felt like ripping something away from myself. Claire must have seen the struggle on my face. "It's hard, I know," she said softly. "But this is the best chance they have. They don't belong in a home, they belong out there." She gestured toward the trees beyond the fence. I crouched down as the cubs were gently lifted and carried toward their enclosure. For one last moment, both turned their heads toward me, ears twitching, eyes steady. One even lifted a paw against the side of the crate, as if reaching out. My throat tightened, but I managed to smile. "Take care of them," I whispered. Walking back to my car, the emptiness beside me was sharp. The carrier sat folded in the trunk, and the drive home felt quiet, almost hollow. Still, underneath the sadness was a thread of pride. I had given them a chance they never would have had otherwise. Months passed. Life returned to its routines, but the memory of those golden eyes lingered. Then, one afternoon, an email arrived from the center. Attached was a short video from a forest camera trap. I clicked play, and my breath caught. The footage showed a lynx moving through tall grass, her body strong and sure. Behind her bounded 2 smaller figures, bigger than when I had last seen them, but still unmistakably the cubs I had cared for. Their coats were sleek, their movements lively, their ears tipped with those familiar tufts. They followed close, weaving through the sunlight with ease. The message below the video was simple: they're thriving. They're free. I leaned back, tears blurring my vision. That chance encounter outside a grocery store had led to this: a life saved, a future restored. It was proof that even the smallest choices can ripple outward, changing the course of more lives than we imagine.